excuse me, I'm a little bit further down. I had the opening slide up. So let's go there in any event to get started. And I want to start by just kind of having us think a little bit about the world of a policymaker, because it's very easy to speak in a very general sense in terms of, we will engage with policymakers, or policymakers are not taking up our research, or, we're managing. But one of the key messages just to think about is that policymakers are people too. And we need to think for a moment maybe about the environment in which policymakers operate, also recognizing that there's a huge diversity. When we say policymakers, we can mean different things. We might mean a civil servant who thinks of their position pretty much as purely implementing political decisions that are made at a higher level, or frameworks like a sectoral strategy or so forth. We might be thinking about parliamentarians. We might be thinking about individuals within a particular ministry or a particular directorate within that ministry or department. Could be a higher level. And then, of course, we recognize that there are institutions in the region, regional institutions. We think about the Nairobi Convention, regional fisheries bodies, East African communities, SADC, that are also engaged in those policy discussions, and which, where we often see our research being relevant. So, in that world, depending if it's a civil servant or an elected official, there's already a clear deadline in which, he or she's got to make his or her mark in terms of policy impact. There's pressure in terms of accountability for multiple agendas. Everything from, making sure that certain campaign promises or high-level commitments that the president may have made is being implemented, contributing to the implementation of a national development plan, a sectoral strategy, pressure on, in terms of international commitments, perhaps there's a communication around from a central Ministry of Planning and Monitoring and Evaluation, or from the Vice President's office saying, we've developed this integrated reporting system where we need to report on our implementation of the SDGs, and you need to be able to explain what's happening in your department or directorate that's going to contribute to those SDGs. That person is likely being lobbied by a variety of groups, some with transparent agendas, some less so, but all those groups believe that their position is important and that it's valid. And there are personal values, there are worldviews, there are lenses through which this decision-making is filtered. And in that context, again, returning to this idea that policymakers are people, when faced with complexity in that way, we all have a tendency to go to a certain small group of people that we might have a long-standing relationship with, people that we trust, that we can talk through certain ideas. And that dynamic has potential for positive influence, but also negative influence. That advisor or just personal contact the person have may not be the best person to speak to. That brings me back constantly to this reminder, and this came out of a workshop on policy engagement that was hosted a few years ago, saying, the good news is that evidence can matter. The bad news is that often it does not. And we also need to pause and think about the world in which we're operating now. This language of alternative facts and fake news and post-truth. And again, putting ourselves in the shoes of that policymaker, probably just about everyone she speaks to has some sort of, in inverted commas, science, some research or some survey that they're bringing to the fore to bolster their arguments. And in that environment, it can be very hard to decide what is legitimate, or how do you weigh the evidence that's being presented to you. And I think this has been illustrated for us kind of in real time this year, as we've seen the response, the social response, the political response, and then the scientific and research response to the COVID pandemic. And I mean, we've seen those same dynamics play out in the science and policy and kind of personal perceptions related to climate change. But because COVID has been so extreme and relatively fast and kind of all pervasive, it's become so clear how these personal biases on the part of individuals, I mean, I'm sure we've all had conversations with friends or family who pitch, you know, pretty far-fetched theories about COVID and what is effective treatment and how serious it is and so forth. So those personal lenses, but then also the personal lenses of political leadership and the drastic impact that can have in terms of an effective response. I mean, it's not just the US. Brazil is various other examples, and a broad spectrum of responses. And generally, the research, the data that's available to everyone from the World Health Organization and from various studies and legitimate research organizations. I mean, all these players have access to that information, but we see them interpreting that in various different ways, questioning the authority, and ultimately making political decisions across a very wide spectrum in terms of effective versus not effective response. So I think that also kind of is a useful reminder to us as we get started of this interface between science and policy and what can still go wrong. I mean, just as an aside, if you haven't done so already, there's this rather far-fetched documentary on the COVID pandemic called Plandemic. And there's also on YouTube a kind of analysis of the scientific legitimacy of the arguments presented there. But I mean, I think those two videos watched together is a fascinating illustration of how a position can be couched as appearing scientific, but actually being something far from that. Now, this is not just important for us to understand as researchers, but we need to have that understanding that this is the world in which a policymaker operates and attempts to make decisions. So that lesson is important. Part of that discussion and introductions, and this is again where, you know, maybe I'll use a bit of a metaphor to describe this, but for me, working, you know, more than a decade in a think tank that has a kind of policy engagement mandate, you know, speaking to people in the research community, in the policy community, largely it's true that if you don't buy into the why, if you don't have a personal conviction that science to policy engagement is important, then the how, the technique, is not going to help you all that much. I thought about maybe a metaphor. You know, I was born in Namibia. I grew up with my dad fishing there, and I still do some fishing and have a few friends who do it. Now, I mean, you can walk down to the beach and you can cast your line into the water, and sure, you know, maybe you'll catch something. But if you've got that personal interest, if you've got that conviction, if you're really interested in what you're doing, you're going to do so much more. You're going to be looking at the times. You're going to be thinking about water temperature. You're going to be matching your bait to the specific species you're targeting. And then also ongoing, you're going to be watching how that tide changes. You're going to be thinking about whether you're getting bites on the bait that you're using, and you're going to be adjusting as you go. So, I mean, it's that extra engagement that kind of brings the theory and the practice and the techniques to life. And I really do think that's important, and something to reflect on personally as well. You know, again, as I said, you can go through the motions, you can apply these ways of thinking or structures or techniques, and you know, it's not going to be entirely useless, but you know, it's going to be just so much more effective if you can bring yourself into that kind of mental space to do the work. Um, then also this point that we need to reach of understanding, you know, thinking about that world of the policymaker, thinking about all the pressures, the constraints, the limitations in which he or she operates. It is a reality that it's rarely a straight line of saying, what does the evidence say? Okay, we go directly with that. It's one question, one answer, and direct policy question. There are going to be times when, and there are other factors that are shaping policy. There are other considerations that policymakers need to think about. There's sometimes trade-offs that need to be made. So can we kind of accept that that is the space in which we operate without kind of giving way to cynicism, without saying, well, what's the point? And again, that I want to return to something is, you know, in these initial, we'll get into the more structured details sooner, but I'm kind of trying to draw some broad pictures here, is how we think about policymakers, and that theme of policymakers or people also matters. And it's something we also need to check our own biases on. And this is something I've, you know, observed and reflected on in people that I work with, is what are our assumptions and biases around policymakers? I mean, if our basic takeaway is that policymakers are incompetent, corrupt, and basically unwilling and incapable, you know, if that's our basic assumption about our policy community, it becomes very hard to effectively communicate and to engage in a dialogue. And you might think you're able to be professional and hide some of those assumptions, but trust me, it shines through. And once you lose that sort of trust, or the person you're trying to engage in dialogue with has that perception that you know, you have these pretty negative biases, it's very hard to move forward in a constructive way. So, I mean, I hope certainly that, you know, you've signed up to this workshop, that you do have that personal interest and conviction, and I think we've heard through the introductions that that's generally the case in this group. But, you know, if you still have those lingering doubts about the why, I think take some time to reflect on that. It's also important because of how, you know, the details or the steps that I'll present. Again, it's not baking a cake, it's catching a fish. When you bake a cake, if you've got your ingredients right, you control certain variables like temperature, you put it together, you follow the recipe step by step, you are going to get a cake at the end of the process. If any of you else out there have tried fishing before, you know that fishing doesn't work in that way. You can do everything right. Sometimes it's just not going to happen for you, but you're trying to put yourself in the zone where it's more likely that things are going to happen. And that's the approach we need to take, instead of this kind of cookie cutter recipe type of approach. More than that, I think thinking about this stuff is also important because even if you are convinced, I'm sure there are probably some people in your ambit in your institutions, at a university session, setting, or a research institution, who haven't bought in and are quite skeptical about this process. So it's your personal understanding, but there's also that sense of being able to be an advocate for science and policy communication within your institution. Two more points I want to make as kind of broad introductory themes. Is bring your personal style to it. You know, some people I've engaged with, even within our own institute, have a sense that science to policy communication, okay, I'm a researcher, I'm not a communicator, I'm not articulate, I'm not good on social media, I'm not good in a workshop setting. That's not for me. Like, someone else needs to do that. Two responses. The first is these broader techniques and themes and questions that we're going to be addressing over these 2 days. You need to filter that through your own personal style. I mean, I've got to say that, especially when I started at SCI, at this institute, and even to today, I'm not a natural networker. And, you know, there were many conferences I went to where I pretty much stood in a corner and drank coffee and or had this very silly kind of transactional approach where I thought, you know, if I get a bunch of business cards from people, that must mean I'm engaging with people, but not really having any proper conversations. And it's a process. And Romy, my colleague, who you'll hear from there, has always been a very natural networker, and within minutes knows half the people in the room. And our policy engagement too, you know, we're trying to achieve the same objectives. We ask ourselves the same questions, but you have that personal style that you can bring to it. So please don't tell yourself, you know, I'm not articulate, I'm not a good speaker, I'm not a good speaking to groups of people. So this communication aspect of it is just not for me. You know, check those, personalize it, but also challenge yourself. Challenge yourself about where you can grow and build those techniques. And then the next message is collaborate. Collaborate, but don't abdicate. In other words, by abdicate, I mean you hand over and you say, I did the research, there are other people who do the communication, my role ends here. You can work, you know, at an institution level, at a university. There are often people specializing in communications who are working on publications, you know, people who can maybe help in things like designing infographics and so forth, or designing communication tools generally. So obviously we want that collaborative approach, but collaborate, don't abdicate. Don't just hand over the research and say, okay, my job is done. Stay involved, see what you can learn, follow the process and see what the outcomes are. So one conceptual tool, and I'll just quickly go back to the previous slide, and I'll return to this when I, as I said, get into those 10-point structure of points that I want to cover. But one way of thinking in terms of policy processes is the policy cycle, and that in a very basic form is what's presented in that circular image on the slide there. And it's generally presented as a pretty kind of systematic, sequential process where there's a societal problem or a problem identified. It might be an environmental problem. There's an agenda setting process, debate around what is important, what the options are. That leads into a policy development process, which then takes you to policy implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation, learning, which feeds into a renewed cycle of dealing with those problems again. And oftentimes a revision and adjustment of your policy implementation, or even the policy itself, revising legislation, developing new strategies, and so forth. Now, this is useful, and again, as I said, I will refer to this later. So I want us to just kind of, in our minds, have this picture. But there's another point to be made, and that is that the policy process in reality, and I mean, this is obvious, if you've ever seen a parliamentary debate, a televised parliamentary debate, you know that the policy-making process isn't as neat, it isn't sequential, and that there's a lot of factors that come into play. So this thing of policy process being complex, multifactorial, and nonlinear, basically being messy. Now, that is also a reality that we need to keep in our minds as we talk through all these things. And we need to check with ourselves and kind of face the reality that often our policy influence or our science to policy communication strategies and plans are also linear, time-bound, with clear causal links. You know, X strategy is being revised in June 2021, therefore we're going to do research which will initiate with the consultation process in these and these months. We will, you know, finalize our research in January, February, which will allow 3 months to engage with policymakers and ensure that our inputs are incorporated into the final results as it is revised in June. You know, you have this very rational, sequential, time-bound plan, and you know, the reality again becomes very messy. You know, that policy revision process might be delayed by a full year. So we need to think about that, but we also need to think about how we engage with those parties that, you know, are holding us account for science to policy engagement, and that conversation needs to be had. How do we how do we strike that balance between accountability and flexibility? We can't go too far to the flexibility side and just say, well, it's a messy process, things didn't work out quite as planned, so we weren't able to achieve any of our science to policy communication deals. Kind of anything goes. Nor can we go too far on the accountability side to say, well, you had this plan, it was in your log frame, and you haven't met it. And I don't want to hear stories about issues outside of your control. Obviously, there's some space in the middle there where one finds a balance. And that's something, again, as I said, that we need to think about as we design our strategies and plans. We need to keep it in mind personally, again, thinking about that inner kind of motivation and commitment to the work. And we need to have that be part of our dialogue with those who are holding us accountable. It might be a department head, a research head, a research director. It might be a funder on a particular project. There is good news. We've got a lot of lessons emerging from practical experience, including in the region. There's increasing buy-in from research managers, funders, and other stakeholders on this kind of science to policy communication, the importance of it. There are a lot of insights from other fields. There's a lot been written about evidence-based policy making, science to policy communication, monitoring and evaluation for science to policy communication or science to policy in fields like climate, in health, in education. And there are insights that can be drawn from that and applied to our thinking as we operate in the ocean governance space, shall we say broadly. And yeah, that research and guidance is out there. And I'll take a moment to plug two documents, very closely linked documents that I worked on under the WIOGEN program. The WIOGEN program funds the WIOGEN project, as well as a set of other projects. And anyway, the link is up there, but you could also just Google WIOGEN Science to Policy Uptake Report, and you should get to that link. And those are very useful documents. A lot of the content that we're working through in this presentation actually comes from those documents, and there are case studies from the region itself to illustrate some of the points that we make there. There's also not so good news. It's going to stay hard, it's complex, it's demanding, and the results are uncertain. But again, as I say, that doesn't mean we can become cynical about this and just say, well, we're giving up. It's also, you know, some of these lessons you keep learning, and I can definitely attest to that personally. I've got some young kids. I know some of the participants definitely have some young kids. And well, let me just say, you don't go to a parenting workshop or read a book about how to raise boys and then think, okay, well, I've got it now. I've got the technique. I just need to apply these techniques and then everything's going to go smoothly with this whole parenting thing. You know, it just doesn't work that way. You need the information. You can certainly benefit from the information and structured thinking, but you know, that hard, complex, demanding, and some lessons you keep learning remains very true. And I've said this a few times, but again, sometimes you're going to be ignored, your results dismissed. You know, it hurts personally, and it's also, you know, it can hit you. But we need to get used to it. We need to introspect, see what we could have done better, what went wrong, and again, just again and again, I'll deliver this message: don't stop engaging. So there's actually this fantastic guide, and both the guidance I referred you to earlier, that's published through WIOGEN and Murvison, both those two documents kind of use this basic structure, which I didn't come up with. I mean, I went through a lot of the literature on science to policy, but there's a publication by the Overseas Development Institute, which just very briefly and in simple language and in a nice structure gives 10 kind of key themes to think about in science to policy communication. And the remainder of the presentation, we're just going to work through that structure and raise some comments. But again, as I said, all this content is actually captured in those guidance documents. So yeah, we definitely be able to return to it. So I'm going to go through these and just make some comments. We start with asking ourselves, what do we want to influence? Again, it's very easy to say to a funder or just speak in general terms about we want to influence policy. What does that mean? What exactly is the policy issue or the theme or the process that we want to influence? Have we thought clearly about exactly what that influence looks like? What change do we want to see? Is it, where is this, if it's a policy instrument, where is it in that policy development process? You know, is it a green paper, you know, a very early stage policy document that's taking shape? Is it a white paper? That's typically where you're engaging with in a kind of ministerial departmental setting. Is it a piece of legislation that's currently being considered within the parliamentary process and, you know, public hearings and so forth through that process? Or are we just trying to shift the kind of understanding and worldview and insights of certain policymakers so that they implement policy that might already be out there? It's not new policy that we're talking about, but we're talking about how to implement a particular set of policy objectives more effectively. You know, maybe a policy objective says, makes a high-level commitment or a high-level political commitment to the Convention on Biological Diversity, makes a high-level commitment around marine conservation and preservation and sustainable management of fish stocks. So you have that high-level commitment, but you're trying to engage with policymakers to say, well, in order to reach this objective, our research suggests that, a particular route to go. How can expanding marine protected area coverage in Tanzania help contribute to the commitments that the country has made in terms of its own national strategies and in terms of broader things like SDG 14, for example. So know what you want to influence. And we want to be as specific as possible. Again, being clear about the risks. As I said in my earlier example, you can be very specific about a policy process or an upcoming policy window, and that might move. So we want to be specific, but we also want to be explicit about risks. Know who you want to influence. Again, specificity is important here. And again, we speak so often about engaging with policymakers. Well, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about policymakers? And you can really get granular with this. Think about a parliamentary committee. Now, you might be trying to influence a bill that's being considered by a parliamentary committee. But you need to ask yourself, who do I work through? How do I access that debate? Is it as simple as presenting my research at a parliamentary hearing? Is there something more I can do? I mean, in the South African system, each parliamentary committee has a content advisor who has a responsibility to undertake research and help synthesize research and evidence on a particular issue and present that to the committee. So you want to make sure that that content advisor is at least aware of your research and hopefully kind of buys into the arguments that you're making. But also in a context of, let's say, for example, a political system that's very heavily dominated by one political party, it could be that the key decision isn't made in that parliamentary committee. It's made in the political party caucus, who also listen to their own set of researchers or may engage with particular think tanks or, and so forth. So we need to think about that as well. If, I mean, the decision is essentially made before the parliamentary committee votes on it, just because of the dynamics of the balance of party representation, then it could be too late by the time you want to engage with that parliamentary committee. You need to put the work into convincing the majority party that your approach makes sense. I mean, again, all of this you don't necessarily have to do yourself. You can certainly think about collaboration and allies, either within the political system or within the research community, within civil society, and much more broadly. So it's not that, again, you need to be the person to deliver that message, but you need to think through these things very carefully. Okay, know when to influence. This takes us a little bit back to the policy cycle discussion we had. Obviously, your policymakers need to be aware of your research at the key point where they need to take action. But that doesn't mean, again, if we take it back to a parliamentary hearing, yes, if you present your research results and some of the policy implications of that research at a parliamentary hearing, that viewpoint will be heard and may well influence the thinking of the committee as they consider a particular bill. But so much better if you have an existing relationship with key policymakers already, that they already are aware of the research process that you've undertaken, that you've engaged with them, trying to understand their dynamics, the demands being placed on them, kind of trade-offs that they're considering in their mind. It builds trust. It allows you to be much more focused and present the appropriate context in terms of the language you're using to present your view. So, I mean, that relationship, when to influence is not just about that key point when the decision is made. In fact, so much better if you're thinking of when in terms of the relationship building. Now, this is, I sometimes have a bias towards thinking in terms of projects because I'm not in a research institution like Kimfrey or in a university setting. Being in a think tank, we tend to work on a project basis. And I'm aware that that's not always equally applicable, but the point I want to make is that this kind of thinking about relationship building is relevant both in terms of a longer term relationship and specific to a project. So, I mean, when you kick off a project, those policymakers that you hope to speak to, perhaps only towards the end that you can deliver your results, you need to start that conversation early. The last thing you want is to reach the end of a 9-month or a 2-year research process and go off to present your results to policy stakeholders you've identified, and their response is, well, you know, you're close, but this isn't exactly what we're, or if you just tweak that research design somewhat, you could have answered a really pressing problem that is, engaging for us. And again, there might be, again, coming back to the trust, there might be a level of suspicion that arises if this research is just suddenly presented as a fait accompli. So think about that relationship building. And again, the caveat, as much as we say we need to plan, and we'll return to the whole planning thing, and you're thinking about policy windows, you need to remember that unexpected opportunities will also emerge. So we need to be flexible, and we're going to discuss what that looks like in more detail tomorrow. Build relationships and networks. So I've already touched on most of these points. Think about allies, think about collaborators, think within the research community, think within the policy community, and elsewhere. Now, I'm not sure if we're going to have all that much time to discuss this particular point, but just reflecting personally, one can use the media to get one's point across, but you need to think through that very carefully. Sometimes, there are sensitive issues, and I don't know, personally, my sense has been that trying to use public communication like the media to try and kind of embarrass the government into action rarely works. It can work. Sometimes it can be a legitimate strategy, but you've got to think very carefully about that. And you've got to be very conscious if that is going to be the strategy you pursue. You've got to take that on consciously. Don't just fall into it because you think, well, talking about my research results and where we see policy gaps and policy failures and putting it out in the media is a good way to enhance visibility. So let's do it. Think through what your final objectives are. And the same can be said for social media. We touched on this. Policy development is not a linear process, complex, multifactorial, non-linear. Yet again, as we build those relationships, as we get to know policymakers where we can on a personal level as human beings, we realize that there are formal and informal rhythms to the policymaking process. But we need to be flexible. We need to accept that policymaking is inherently political. As I said, personal institutional values, questions about resource availability, what is technically possible and what is politically possible in terms of particular solutions. We need to accept that part of the policy process is making trade-offs, is considering the demands and the interests of various stakeholder groups. Evidence can support that decision-making, but you know, at some point, certain trade-offs need to be made. There are political considerations. So let's not kind of fool ourselves about that. Plan your engagement. It's the whole kind of fail to plan, you plan to fail. Absolutely, you do need to think through these things. And I've said it a few times already, I'll say it again. Obviously, we need to know as we plan that the reality probably isn't going to play out exactly according to plan. We're going to have to adjust and learn and do what we need to. But if you don't have that initial plan, it becomes very difficult to move forward in a structured way. Focus on ideas and be propositional. Again, on the kind of political side, I mentioned this. Frame recommendations within the realms of what is possible, both technically and politically. Be ambitious, but realistic. And I think there's a tendency sometimes amongst researchers to kind of focus on trying to communicate to policymakers the scale and the urgency of the problem, which is a starting point. I mean, you generally do need to start the conversation there, whether it's about climate change or overexploitation of fish stocks or whatever the case may be. But we then need to move on to what is possible as solutions. What are participable, and it helps policymakers when we also think through what is ideal and what considerations we need to take into, what issues we need to take into consideration, and therefore kind of make that balance between what's technically possible and politically possible. I mean, ultimately, it will be the policymakers themselves who make the call, but we can certainly help them. And again, it builds that trust if we can show that that's also part of our thinking. It takes time, stick at it. I mean, there's an interesting conversation to be had here in terms of the reporting and the responsibilities. For example, again, reflecting on a project base, because sometimes you don't have that linear process and things don't work according to plan. I don't think we're going to have time now in this session, but I've asked Romy to also just reflect on some examples. And one of the examples is some work that she did on mangrove governance in Mozambique, where there was, you know, quite a long timeline and not a direct timeline that we could foresee between doing our initial research and the actual policy influence. But engage with the policymakers. It should be an ongoing conversation. Stay updated on where policymaking processes are. Don't just have one meeting with your policy audience at the beginning. Let them know about the project. You know, explain to them what you're trying to achieve, and then 6 months later or a year later, knock on their door and say, well, here are our results. Stay engaged, understand what's happening in those processes, and then monitor, learn, and adjust along the way. Seek feedback, adjust, adapt, continuously review, and capture learnings as you go. These are learnings for a particular project or process, but just personal or institutional reflections as well, and learnings, so that you do continue to build. Remembering, as I said at the beginning, some of those lessons you have to unfortunately learn time and time again, but you know, let's at least try and reduce the frequency of that, and not knock our heads on the same wall every time. Right, so that's the 10-point structure. That's the basic way that I've certainly found useful in terms of thinking about science to policy. As you'll see, a lot of it is mindset issues. I haven't gone into, I mean, we're not going to go into very specific issues like, okay, well, how do you write a policy briefing, for example? I mean, that'll come up in the discussion tomorrow around communication. But what I'm trying to get at is, again, a lot of what we're talking about here is mindset issues. And as you've heard now, these things are not rocket science. They're not extremely complicated. It's just that they can be quite difficult. And you need to make that distinction. So it's about having that framework, having that structure, having those basic kind of conceptual orientation, and then learning and adjusting along the way. So that brings me to the end